Your job title buys you a pay bump and a death sentence. On a medieval battlefield, siege engineer means everyone knows exactly where to aim. You stand near the carpenters, the miners, and the stacked stones that scream. Expensive problem solver, and every crossbowman on the wall decides you deserve a personalized bolt. Knights preen, priests bless, quartermasters curse, and you measure angles with a strip of knotted cord, because trigonometry has not been invented on paper here, but it exists in your head and your calloused hands. Before sunrise, you wake to the slow heartbeat of a war machine under construction. Mallets on oak, the rasp of a two-man saw. The countryside has already been disassembled into timber, oak stripped for frames, ash for shafts, willow for wicker gabions, pine for quick and dirty shelters that burn like sins. The air tastes of damp hearth, wet rope, and human fatigue. Your breakfast is whatever survives the night. A heel of bread hard enough to wedge a beam, salty pork, a ladle of barley pottage, and weak ale, because water near an army tends to kill whoever trusts it. Your pay, if you work for a royal army, sits somewhere between respectable and irresistible. English accounts in the 14th and early 15th centuries show skilled pioneers at 2d a day, carpenters at 4, and a master of engines around 12d. Sometimes more when the king wants the wall in front of him to stop existing. Nice coin. Terrible retirement plan. You get a Latin job title, and it sounds almost elegant. Ingeniator, Magister Machinarum, Maître des Engins, Ingenieur, a mashup of mathematician, contractor and person, blamed when stone bounces off a wall instead of through it. You manage teams that look nothing like chivalry. Rope makers, smiths, wheelwrights, wedge hammer men, sappers who can hear through dirt. They take orders easily when the wood chips fly and ignore you when a noble's nephew wants to play siege. Commander for an afternoon. The work begins long before the first stone flies. You map ground with your boots and a length of cord. Feel the shoulder of the slope. Eyeball the river. Pick the wind. The wall you face is not just a wall. It is an accumulation of anxiety and tax money. A curtain with a base batter. Towers big enough for kitchen gardens. Arrow slits arranged like organ pipes. Maybe hoardings or machicolations, projecting to drop stones straight down. If the place was updated after about 1200, the towers are round or polygonal, so your stones catch no square corner to split. If you are unlucky, it sits on rock and has a good well. Your job is to make that investment look temporary. Myth correction arrives early. The fantasy of boiling oil, pouring in rivers from the battlements, sells tapestries. Not history. Oil was expensive and precious. Defenders almost always used water, stones, timber offcuts, hot sand that sneaks through armor, quicklime tossed to blind, fire pots that stick, and whatever horrifying mix the garrison latrines produced. The noise of a siege is the clatter of stones, the size of pigs tumbling down stairs of air, not gallons of olive oil, cascading like a banquet gone to hell. Still, you wrap your structures in fresh hides because heat and pitch do exactly what they promise. You begin with earthworks, spades before glory. The first line you draw is a ditch and bank to protect your men, then a covered approach, sap heads with wicker gabions filled with earth. Your people push big pervises and mantlets on wheels toward the wall, shields so large they groan when they roll. One slip and a crossbow bolt picks any gap in your equipment. As if guided by a divining rod, crossbowmen fire with a flat mechanical hunger. A crank, a click, a bolt punching through the air somewhere around. 100 to 120 meters per second. A good arbalist tears the day open at 200 meters and maims at more. Longbows whistle to overhead arcs, but here, under a wall, the crossbow is the bully. Step 2 is the reason you carry a plumb line like a rosary. You build something that throws stone. Maybe you start with a traction machine, a mangonel powered by sweating men hauling a rope. But you aim higher, literally. You aim for a counterweight trebuchet, the big sibling that turns gravity into rage. The parts fill an acre. You choose oak because it accepts insults without splintering. The axle sits in a cradle of greased ash block. The throwing arm rises taller than the houses of 3 villages stacked. You tie on a sling the length of a cart and a half. The arm ratio matters. 3-to-1 is a good compromise. 4-to-1 if the wood forgives you. You calibrate by failing publicly. More sling length for range, less for height. A hair-bent release pin to adjust the stone's final word by degrees. You do not have calculus. You do not need it. Your team tests, watches the curve, and moves the wedge of finger's width. Every bruise on your shins is a data point. The counterweight becomes a crate filled with stones that collectively weigh as much as a generous ox cart. You aim for a shot mass of maybe 60 to 150 kilograms for serious work. Multiply the shot mass by 20, 30, sometimes more to size your counterweight. Even the theoretical perfect ratio bows to timber that creaks like an old saint. The famous ones get names. The English in 1304 named their monster outside Stirling Castle Warwolf, Le Warwolf, and every chronicle that smelled the dust wrote the brag down. The Lanercost Chronicle records how the garrison tried to surrender once Warwolf stretched its back across the field, and the king insisted on one demonstration strike before accepting their keys. That is not a fairy tale of victors revising glory. That is a number on a ledger and a line in a monk's neat hand. A shot by a top-tier trebuchet travels a few hundred meters in a lazy but murderous arc. Some chroniclers shout bigger because human memory loves bigger. But 200 to 300 meters with proper aim makes you a professional with a reputation. Your worst enemy is not just the wall. It is friction that robs range, the sling that releases a blink too early or late, the timber that shifts because a wedge shrank under the afternoon sun. You fight humidity with grease and prayer, and you learn the rhythm of a rate of fire that looks painfully slow to any noble pacing behind you. A big counterweight engine might throw a shot every 5 to 10 minutes when your crew is fresh, less when they are bleeding and tired. Small Perriers can thump faster. Several stones in the time a lord counts patience on his fingers, but the big frames do the bulldozer's work. When Warwolf or its cousins do their job, they break merlins, knock hoardings into splinters, and smash corners until the wall becomes a polite suggestion. Civilization drifts in with carpenters' broad axes. You order a belfry, a siege tower, only when the wall looks tired or the ground lets you roll without weeping. There are towers attested at heights that make owls dizzy. 15, 20, even 30 meters of timber, sheathed in raw hides and wet mats, bristling with pavises and bridged to the wall. You lash it together with ropes thicker than a wrist, the wheels as tall as a man's chest. You line the front with leather and clay to shrug off quick fire. It never quite shrugs off everything. If the defenders have prepared, they wheel out a fire cart, they drop red-hot chains, they fling a burning barrel of pitch, and your beautiful tower becomes a bonfire that walks like a drunk. Under the surface of all this theatre, the subtle work eats stone from below. You run a mine toward the foot of the curtain. Men with pickaxes dig a crawl space under the room of the wall. You prop it with timber. You stack brushwood and pitch, and then you light a fire that turns supports into heat. If you happen to be King John at Rochester in 1215, you purchase the fat of 40 pigs of the least value, because cheap pigs burn with enthusiasm and the Chronicle. Roger of Wendover's version records the ugly detail with the calm of an accountant. When the props fail, the wall slumps with a sound that you feel more than hear. That means sappers on the other side also had something to say. Countermining gnaws right back. Defenders sat bowls of water near the wall to watch for the trembling fingerprint of your picks. They lay their ears to the cold stone, tunnel toward your tunnel, then break through and turn a mine into a fist fight under the earth. Oxygen manages the schedule. Lamps tell the truth, and no one smells good. The safest place in these moments is the middle of nowhere, and you are nowhere else. At some sieges, your enemy is not the wall or the mine. It is time. Calais, 1346 to 1347, shows what happens when a town with a harbour clings to a supply line and a stubborn idea. A siege becomes a city. Houses come down to feed fire. Carts queue for miles. Tethered cattle, rude bakeries, and a ring of forts that choke the horizon. If you work for a king with money, you build a belt of earth that wraps the place, and then you wait for famine to decide. Froissart wrote pages on endurance and ritual surrender, and you can almost hear the boredom humming between the lines. Siege work is often patience disguised as violence. You carry books in your head because paper tears. Vigius, the late Roman voice in medieval ears, tells you to keep your men digging, to build testudos, to assault only where ground and morale agree. Villard de Honnecourt's notebook, drawn around the 1220s to 1230s, gives little mechanical hints, slings and screws and frames, that only make full sense when you've already built a version and watched it misbehave. Conrad Kezer's Bellefortes, finished around 1405, reads like a shopping list written during a fever dream. Floats, rams, devices that look like angry furniture. Walther de Malmy's manuscript of 1326 shows something even stranger to your early 14th century brain. A pot de fer cannon launching an iron-headed arrow, a drawing that says, "The future arrived with a hiss and a shrug." Gunpowder lingers at the edges of your world before it slams the door off its hinges. Roger Bacon writes in 1267 about black powder's properties. The Liber Ignium of Marcus Gracchus, a compilation from around the late 13th or early 14th century, gives recipes that smell caustic and read dangerous. By the 1320s, European illustrators sketch cannons that look like iron pots throwing bolts. By the 1340s, actual campaigns start to list guns among the luggage. At Crécy in 1346, small cannon fire. How many and how effectively sparks arguments, but nobody denies their presence. The first ones feel like noisy curiosities. Then founders learn to make barrels from wrought iron staves and hoops, like oversized barrels, or cast bronze into something that behaves, and the learning curve tilts into blood. Trebuchets do not vanish overnight. They work well. They use gravity and wood from a nearby forest. They are fixable with axes and a swear. Gunpowder shows up with a supply chain that reads like an alchemist's to-do list. Saltpeter must be farmed from niter beds thick with urine and manure. Charcoal must be cooked carefully. Sulfur must be bought from someone with a line to a volcano or a well-connected merchant. Early bombards throw stone balls because iron is expensive and too heavy per cube of destruction. Stone shatters on impact and makes murder snow. Iron shot arrives later when barrel metallurgy improves, and kings find money. You shift from the rhythm of creaks to the percussion of thunder. Your crew becomes louder, dirtier, and perhaps more deaf. Saint Barbara, the old protectress against sudden death, becomes the informal patron of your gunners. A bombard, named in the account books, requires a small town to move it. 60 oxen for the largest Turkish pieces in 1453, 200 handlers to coax the team along, the road reinforced with timber so wheels do not carve trenches into the map. Orban, the founder who cast for Mehmed II, produces a monster for the siege of Constantinople in 1453, reportedly firing balls in the hundreds of kilograms, something like 600 to 700 kilograms in some reports. Chroniclers claim 7 shots a day before the barrel demands a rest and a bath. A dozen weeks later, gaps in Theodosian stone mark the pace of gunpowder's conclusion to an era. You whirled before that finale sees laboratories disguised as fields. You learn to ram powder gently, to leave air for flame to bite, to swab the touch hole so embers do not turn a hand into a rag, to wedge the barrel snug against a timber cradle, to aim a barrel with pegs and shims, because trunnions do not yet exist on the earliest pieces. Later, trunnions appear, and you cradle guns like babies that kick. Culverins and bombards sit on beds of timber. Verglairs and serpentine pieces mix in the inventory. A ribold or ribauldequin, an organ gun, rolls out to terrify more than kill. A fan of barrels that rattles armor and morale. The hazards multiply. A miscast hoop lets go, and the barrel peels like fruit. A vent spits back fire and blindfolds a gunner with scars. A serpentine powder ignites too quickly and flips a light piece like furniture in a bar brawl. Your hearing tumbles downhill, and you learn to read lips before lip reading earns a name. You still keep the trebuchets, because when your powder goes soft in rain and your sulfur shipment gets stolen by a border lord who calls it customs, gravity keeps its appointments. Seek work eats carpenters. You hear the numbers in the logistics. A single four-wheeled wagon takes about 1,000 to 1,500 kilograms if the road is kind and the axle honest. Oxen pull slowly, maybe 3 to 4 kilometers an hour, but reliably. War is a movement of wood and food, not just banners. A siege tower could consume hundreds of timbers and untold nails. A large counterweight trebuchet swallows entire hamlets of oak and days of rope-making that blister palms into maps. Your quartermaster counts in thousands of nails and in miles of rope, not in heroic stories. He also quietly rations ale, because no one sharpens a chisel straight while drunk. Inside the camp, reality smells like latrines dubbed too shallow and the sweet medical perfume of vinegar used as a disinfectant because it is what you have. Dysentery joins every siege as a veteran. Typhus, camp fever, joins when lice arrive to vote. You enforce distance between latrines and kitchens as if scripture demands it. Sometimes scripture seems to argue back. Lent still exists in a camp calendar, even while your men salt pork by the tub. On fish days, the fish tastes like something that took a wrong turn while being stored in a barrel. But nobody complains long, because nobody can afford that kind of optimism. Defenders do not act like targets. They are you, with worse angles. They build hoardings, wooden galleries perched over the wall, so they can drop stones straight down and fire crossbows vertically. They pour the kind of sand that sneaks into armor and finds the exact place to burn. They shape murder holes into gatehouse ceilings and make a welcome committee of lead shot and rocks. They send out night sorties to burn your engines, and sometimes they succeed because fire loves dry rope. You pad your engines with clay, soak hides in the ditches, and pray that the wind pushes smoke the other way. Some walls deserve a sermon. Chateau Gaillard above the Seine, sieged in 1203 to 1204 by Philip Tissé, was the pet of Richard I, built fast around 1196 to 1198 and called the Rock. Its triple lines and cunning valley suggest safety. And then the French dig, cut off the river and hide the weaker edges. including a hole through a latrine that becomes a back door to a smaller enclosure. Clever beats brute, and afterwards you add inspect, latrines to your mental checklist for defensive vulnerabilities. Lessons are oddly specific in your trade. You carry real names in your head to stiffen your back. The sappers at Toulouse, in 1218, build a siege engine under Simon de Montfort's gaze. And then, a stone from a defender's mangonel cracks his skull. A warlord falls beneath the arithmetic you know too well. Acre in 1189 to 1191 teaches a generation what happens when two coalitions batter a city and then batter each other while it starves. The kings, Richard and Philip, spitting prestige, and every large engine on both sides gets a name like a pet with bad habits. Some even earn songs. The historians from that age list machines as if listing saints. Your reality is less heroic and far more detailed. The slingstone you hoist has a diameter that your palm knows by weight. A good shot is carefully dressed. Stone, usually limestone or granite, turned into a near sphere, so the air forgives slight misalignment. Undressed fieldstones tumble unpredictably, sometimes a gift because they skip and ricochet like they own the place. Your crew drills to lift, to swing, to release, and to duck. You track injuries like an accountant tracks debts. Crushed fingers under counterweights, snapped ropes twisting knots into bone, broken legs from ladders that lost patience, puncture wounds that smell wrong 2 days later. A surgeon with a chirurgeon's chest keeps threads of linen and iron scalpels in a roll that has seen things. Authority speaks in pages. Accounts from Edward I's campaigns list timber, ropes, iron, and wages for ingainers. The Lanercost monks write plain sentences about Warwolf that still feel like electricity hums through them. Later, in French sources around the siege of Harfleur in 1415, the word ingénieuse sits in the pay lists like a status symbol with splinters. Froissart's chronicles spin pageantry, but the numbers hiding in the lines say your profession has become indispensable and expensive. Not everything about this life points toward the modern myth of medieval darkness. The geometry you use to lay out a line of stakes matches the geometry a surveyor uses in a later century. The ratios you trial and error in a trebuchet match what physics lectures with chalk would say. The rope you twist out of hemp and hair uses the same logic as a ship's rig. Hairs twisted one way into yarns, twisted the other way into strands, twisted the original way into rope. Human hair even shows up in torsion engines, springalds, like an unsettling museum exhibit, because hair tolerates stress with a strange grace. Springalds, those big torsion crossbows inside wooden boxes, deserve a moment. Imagine a gigantic bow run by twisted ropes of sinew and hair, arms thrust into the bundle, a thick bolt set against a slider. They shoot faster than reloaders climb a battlement, but they live on straight lines of sight and hate the angles a curtain offers. They do excellent service inside a gatehouse, defending a passage with a suddenness that erases memory. They also injure operators who think rules are suggestions. Your penknife cuts through another myth. Castles rarely bleed, garrisons out onto the field. Battles in full armor on open ground look great in poems. Real war in your era is a slog of blockades and explosive carpentry. Any general with a brain avoids storming a strong place unless the wall is cracked or the garrison starving. A failed assault writes itself in funerary Latin. An undermined wall writes itself as a path inside. You memorize the signs. A defender evacuates cattle, and you write it down. A plume of smoke from the bakeries thins around midday, and you grin. Fishing boats stop chancing the harbour, and you count days. Parley flags pop up when stone is low, and morale is a rumour. Formal surrender rehearses itself in the same few steps. Hostages, terms for property, money, and the exact degree of humiliation the victor demands. Froissart loved those parts slightly too much. Every rule fractures under stress. The sack of a town goes feral easily. Civilization held together by prestige, until wine, fear, and rage cut the rope. A good commander restrains the spoil by threatening his own men. An excellent commander pays promptly and moves on before boredom finds trouble. Your role here is better when it is boring. A siege that ends without a storm saves lives that never become footnotes. The tools on your belt: speak Latin and curse in French. Line level. Plumb bob. Folding rule measured in local units. L's in one town, tours in another. A toy sits comfortably around 1.95 meters in the French mouth. An L floats somewhere around 45 inches in the English. You carry a wax tablet for field notes because ink runs in tears, and you scratch numbers that feel like spells. Inventory turns into liturgy. 10 dozen faggots for fascines, 100 stakes for pickets, 12 broad axes, 4 adges, 20 wedges, 3 sledges, 2 carts of lime, 5 chains of iron, and a prickle of nails that never seems enough. You borrow men from the garrison to help because you are essentially building a giant machine within arrow range. That phrase explains most of your mistakes. Skirmishes become the pulse of your day, a sally from the gate barrels, out of the postern at a mean hour, a dozen men with hooks and a pot of fire born between them. They look for your nearest mantlet and give it a name in flame. If you predicted it, you have buckets, damp hides, and men who specialize in kicking things off wheels and into ditches. If you did not predict it, the machine burns. 100 hours of labor vanish in the time it takes a rogue to decide whether to be a fuse or a memory. You adapt. You always adapt. You do not get to be purely local. Engineers travel and speak broadly. The Mediterranean teaches Italian and Arabic engineering, a vocabulary your northern timber frames do not know. You learn that Mamluk armies relied on hulking trebuchets called manjanik, that throw with calm cruelty, that Arabic treatises like those attributed to Al-Hassan al-Rama discuss propulsion in ways that translate into your day only after your head stops spinning. You know the Byzantines guarded the recipe of Greek fire like a saint's tooth, and you only see something like it if your campaign ships kiss a Greek-held coast, or if a Crusader chronicle remembers a night burned into the skin. You clip knowledge out of every army you follow, and you stitch your own book into your hands. Your camp has its own class system. Knights nibble roast swan under a canopy if they can afford it. Men-at-arms eat meat that tastes of salt and distant fields. Common soldiers gamble with dice that clatter like teeth. Teamsters swear in a dialect that seems chemically optimized for swearing. Pioneers, diggers, do the constant, ugly work and accept danger as a condition of their wage packet. Your word must sit above all that. Authority here is a heavy log you carry every day. Pay arrives late. It always arrives late. You grease the system with IOUs and salvage. Spoils can keep a crew loyal if they trust you to make the case for a fair share. Once the banner rises over the gatehouse, ransom culture draws strange lines. A noble is worth living to capture. A common soldier is worth nothing alive or dead. And you, valuable, identified, and dangerously useful, float in a grey area. There are proofs of engineers being offered terms to build for the other side, because mechanics tastes immoral and politics tastes hungry. You cannot trust promises the way you trust a knot. Then, late in your career, if your career lasts long, the world tilts. The 15th century becomes the age of serious metal. Names like Dull Greet in Ghent, cast around the 1430s, a bombard that weighs roughly 12,500 kilograms, with a mouth like an open door, toss stones the size of newborn farm animals. Meg in Scotland, given in 1457 according to tradition, and built around the 1440s, sports a bore around 50 centimeters and throws stones roughly 150 kilograms. Such pieces feel like you are pointing a church at a wall. The guns make neighbors nervous. Trunnions, cascabels, carriages with wheels that actually look like a plan rather than apology. Your career becomes carpentry for thunder instead of carpentry for gravity. The speed of a siege picks up. Walls built for trebuchets bruise before bores that throw iron. The Trace Italienne waits on the horizon, a 16th century reply of angular bastions that shrug round impact. A new specialty approaches, and you can smell gunpowder in its breath. Until then, trebuchets remain the most elegant insult you can deliver. Every detail matters. Lubricating the axle with tallow when it is cold, and vegetable oil when it is hot. Draping the sling over the arm, so the release does not catch. Swapping rocks when you crack one, to avoid unpredictable flight. Some crews carefully roughen the stone, claiming the grooves take air better, though that often feels like superstition wearing a workshop apron. You build redundant slings. You keep replacement release pins in a pouch inside your tunic, because anyone who leaves one at home deserves the punishment of improvisation. Weather commands you like a general who never sleeps. Rain turns clay to despair and trenches to soup. Sun dries rawhides and brings your tower one ember closer to a flame. Wind slides stones off target, the wide arc becoming a painter's gesture instead of a blade. You have a catalogue of adjustments in your head. Aim left to allow drift. Wait for gusts to breathe. Fire at dawn when the air is heavy and predictable. Build your base as if the world despises level. Defenders learn you. They swap in wicker screens to catch some of your stones before they hit the wall. They reinforce corners with timbers turned sideways into the masonry. They dangle brushwood mats on chains to make your shots chew spring without flavor. You learn them back. You aim at the place where two plans met in the building. The seam of repairs, the brushed-off corner. You watch mortar for fresh color. You pick the spots where water stains betray lazy maintenance. A castle is a person, and you are very good at arguments. Failure hums along like a tuning fork. You will aim wrong some mornings. You will misread a wind. You will trust a timber that lies. At least one mine of yours will flood. At least one tower you order will crumple on a slope it despised. At least one noble will arrive with advice that belongs in a latrine and will insist you follow it for a day. You grow a thick hide of politeness that protects your job and a mental list of ways to quietly subvert an ignorant command until the ignorant person gets bored. And then there is the drip-drip of paperwork. Every grain of powder, every pig of lead, every timber and rope sits in a clerk's book. You sign your name or your mark until it begins to feel like a curse. If the siege ends with victory, the accounts read like evidence that God favored the right side. If it ends with retreat, the accounts read like evidence for prosecution. Engineers in failed campaigns keep their heads by producing receipts, good numbers, and the continuing belief that their expertise will matter next time. That faith is more durable than wood. Your evenings when you are lucky include the taste of relief. The storms pass, and you count men, machines, and the number of bolts to remake tomorrow. You remove splinters with a quiet grimness. You go through the ritual of oiling, tightening, checking every knot like a rosary. You explain to a young carpenter why wedges change their minds in the afternoon. You show a miner how to pack earth to support a drift. You file the notch in a release pin so it kisses clean. The light goes pink and then violent, and the camp's noise settles into voices that sound human again. Then a messenger arrives with a fresh plan written by someone with a title, and the night recovers its appetite. You travel because war pays, and because knowledge lives in movement. You see Wales under Edward I, iron geometry of castles, and roads where Master James of St. George, a master mason and engineer, put logic into stone in the late 13th century. You watch French kings consolidate with a bureaucratic patience that terrifies more than drums. You watch Italian city-states assemble artillery trains that look like merchant caravans with secrets. You hear about Iberian sieges where stone and powder batter Moorish fortifications, and where the supply line across a strait becomes the real battlefield. The trick repeats in every era. The map beats the sword. The margin of error shrinks near gates. Gatehouses pack layered murder. Portcullises stacked in pairs. Drawbars and side doors. Arrow slits that listen as you approach. Murder holes above that punish anyone who believes a gate is a room. You build rams on wheels, battering heads of iron or wrapped in brands of bronze that move under a testudo of timber and hides. Defenders dangle chains to catch your ram head and fix it. Then they drop beams to stun the structure. You invent ways to move sideways while moving forward. You invent in desperation. Then you write the better version into your head so you do not reinvent tomorrow. Your social standing is absurd. Priests invite you to hear that the crossbow was condemned at the Second Lateran Council in 1139 as unfit for Christian warfare against Christians. And then every respectable Christian army deploys crossbows with joy because they work. A similar cloud of moral worry floats over incendiaries and poisons. In practice, your tools are judged by their results, not by sermons. You attend Mass when the bells tell you to. You make the sign when a barrel roars and survives. Your conscience, if you allow one, takes the form of reducing suffering by making sieges shorter and negotiations more plausible. The alternative is blood and fire through the front door. You develop rituals of accuracy. Your crew paces distance and marks it with stakes. You build crude range tables in your mind. This wedge height and this sling length means this arc to that spot. You paint stones to track flight. You assign names to machines based on their quirks, so you can shout the right adjustments. A trebuchet named for its brutality. A Perrier named for its refusal to shoot straight. A Springald named for its habit of eating string. You turn chaos into a vocabulary your crew understands. Even when the wind steals sound, information becomes a weapon. You pay for rumors about the well inside, how deep, how sweet. You pay for trivia about the last repair, the new mortar like grey bread, the mason who married the baker's daughter and hated working on the north wall because of the wind. You pay for knowledge about a sally port forgotten by everyone except the old man who sweeps it. Your spies are carpenters and masons and teamsters, not spies. They bring back the data you need. They demand coin, not poetry. Sometimes you chase a myth into a wall and discover a truth. The story of trebuchets flinging diseased corpses appears in sources about the 1346-1347 siege of Kaffa in Crimea. Not every siege becomes a plague missile gallery, but disease travels better than any army, and siege camps are disease travel agencies. You keep your latrines downhill. You segregate the sick when you can. You insist on boiling water when the rumor of illness enters camp. You cannot change everything. You rarely change quite enough. You live on the edge of nobility and craft. Some engineers become knights. Many remain master craftsmen, with the ear of powerful men. You keep a little silver aside because your work ends abruptly when a wall collapses the wrong way, or a cannon reveals a flaw with the finality of a funeral. You teach apprentices, like you are leaving every day. You leave notes in the margins carved into the machine itself. Scribe lines on beams, marks on wedges, little secrets forgetting nothing, because you know your apprentice will be standing here with the same wind in his face when your name is a rumour over a fire. The new century walks in with bronze that sings when struck. Better barrels allow iron shot. Smaller guns on wheeled carriages play the ground like fiddlers. The siege becomes more mobile, less opera, more artillery duel. You adjust by standing a little further back. And a lot more death. You are still needed for trench lines, for mines, for towers built to answer towers. You simply share the stage with fire that travels faster than stone. Your old machines still perform when rain and stubbornness cancel glamour. The best part of your work is satisfaction measured in geometry. A wall cracks where you expect. A stone lands where you told a nervous carpenter it would. A mine collapses the exact portion of the curtain you traced with a fingertip on a map. The entire profession turns into a quietly proud smile under a greasy shirt. The worst parts gather like crows. A man you have known since last spring dies under a wheel. A defender's child appears in a parley and looks at your tower with fear so naked it peels the skin raw. A noble orders a storm that looks like theatre and becomes a butcher's rehearsal. You sleep badly that night and the night after. You decide to make your machines smarter to avoid storms in the future. You write that promise in your head where the math lives. Your world is not actually slow. A campaign leaps forward miles at a time once the strong points tip. Siege trains want roads. Roads crawl across a country the way blood crawls into snow. Your structures leave scars on landscapes, filled ditches, broken stone, earthen banks that become village boundaries, and, later, footpaths. Children in a generation you will not see will climb a mound and slide down with laughter, and their hills will be the walls you knocked flat and the trenches you dug. Your career writes geography. A final reality frames it all. Nothing you build is guaranteed to impress. The simplest blockade, the brute force of hunger, will always haunt your elaborate engines. Grain wins wars when clever people starve. As an engineer, you choose efficiency where glory would kill. You learn to love the boring solution. You bribe a guard. You cut a water line. You tempt the commander with a promise of terms that protect property and children. You help negotiate so the gate opens without a last stand. You whisper to a lord that victory with less drama is still victory. The best machine you ever build may be an argument. Through it all, you carry names like prayers and measurements like memories. Rochester, 1215, and the smell of burning fat under a wall. Stirling, 1304, and a king refusing surrender until his toy speaks. Acres carcass of towers and counter-towers, names printed like saints' days. Chateau Gaillard collapsing along seams of pride and time. Constantinople, split by bronze throats, singing doom in 1453. Ghent's dull greed squatting like a dragon that forgot to fly. Edinburgh's Mons Meg, going silent after a crack in 1680, reminds everyone that metal ages too. Treatises plucked from monasteries and palaces. Villard's lines, Kessa's fever dreams, Mailmetti's little cannon that leads to centuries of gun smoke. Froissart's gossip packaged as history that still gives you numbers you can use. You wake each day into a job that never promises tomorrow. Your hands smell of tallow and vinegar. Your ears ring. Your back aches in a pattern specific to an arm's length and sling weight. Your brain holds distances the way poets hold rhymes. You lead people across open ground, under the indifference of walls. You turn the weight of a stone into an argument that reality understands. You are the person who makes sure gravity shows up to work. There is a last scene that repeats in your life, as if the world loves structure. The wall finally splits ugly. The corner drops like a yanked tooth. A plume of dust rides the air and turns men into silhouettes. Silence hits for a heartbeat as everyone recalculates their odds. Then, noise, trumpets or drums or simple yelling. Gatehouse flags shift like fish. A garrison lines up in armor to pretend that this is a battle they can afford. A commander on your side choose a decision. You watch the faces around you and read the future. Your machines creak gently as they settle. Your crew looks to you for orders that are really habits. You do not shout. You do not make speeches. You nod, and the crew begins to secure ropes and wedge wheels and swab barrels. The machine has done what it was born to do. The rest is politics and the arithmetic of suffering. By nightfall, you walk the broken place. You measure the new angle where the wall ends and the slope begins. You note the fresh rubble like a mason who could repair it. You write the final numbers in your head so that the next wall in another country under a different banner meets you already half remembered. Your profession is not romance. It is a recipe for changing facts in public while everyone watches. It is a life built on wood, rope, earth, and patient violence. You never become invulnerable. A bolt will always find an engineer who forgets to dock. A cannon will always remind a human ear how fragile listening can be. An argument with a noble will always threaten your career faster than a broken wedge. You also never become unnecessary. As long as walls stand and food sits inside them, someone will need a person who can turn the world itself into a tool. That person is you. You take your pay. You take the scars. You take the muttered thanks of commanders who know exactly how much glory they owe to carpentry. You take the quiet knowledge that your work shortens wars by days and sometimes years. You take the jokes about boiling oil and correct them with the mildness of a schoolmaster who has been set on fire enough times to have authority. You take the monk's odd smile when he writes your machine's name into his chronicle and knows that name will live longer than both of you. A trebuchet twists in the cold and settles like a ship. A bombard pants smoke in the early light. A mining tunnel holds its breath and then exhales a wall. The camp snores and mutters, and far off, a town sleeps with one eye open. You check a knot. You test a pin. You place your hand on the wood as if a pulse lives there. It does. It is yours. It is the heartbeat of a profession that changes the shape of countries. You are the medieval siege engineer, and your life is brutal, precise, and unforgettable. The numbers in your head break stone. The myths around you break under facts. The wall breaks, or the will, or both. And then the map changes, and your boots stamp a new line into the mud. A 20-ton stone face stares out from a tropical swamp, cheekbones slick with rain, and a helmet pressed low like a heavyweight gearing up for the main event. The mosquitoes are loud, the mud is louder, and this head is not an alien. It is a portrait of power carved by people archaeologists call the Olmec, who built cities on the Gulf Coast of Mexico between about 1500 and 400 B, and then taught an entire region how to do civilization with style. They set the template, and the receipts show up everywhere. A ritual calendar that beats like a metronome across Mesoamerica. A ball game that bounces from village courts to imperial stadiums. jade obsessions so intense that earthquakes barely touch the museums of offerings buried under pyramids of clay. This is the origin story for a cultural starter pack that later Maya, Zapotec, and Aztec elites turn into empires. Later neighbors remix the tracks, push the tech, and expand the audience. But the first big hook drops in the Olmec lowlands, when engineers, priests, sculptors, and farmers look at a swamp and decide it needs more colossal stone heads. The setting feels improbable until it makes perfect sense. The Gulf lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco come loaded with glossy rivers, fresh water, fish, fertile levees, and clay by the mountain of it. That clay becomes architecture. That water becomes power. That mud becomes art. Around 1400 BC, San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan rises on a ridge above the floodplain. Terrace piled after terrace, basalt drains buried to reroute stormwater like a city that has learned to make gravity take meetings. San Lorenzo's arc runs until about 900 BC, when La Venta takes over, sweeping the wetlands with a 33-meter earthen pyramid and an axis layout so precise that it doubles as a calendar. Discovery starts with a jolt. In 1862, a local farmer at Tres Zapoz sent word of a carved head. Jose Melgar y Serrano, a Mexican official, wrote it up and reacted like anyone would who had just met a stone face the size of a pickup truck. That first head became the unofficial thumbnail image of ancient America. By the 1930s and 1940s, Matthew Stirling and his Smithsonian-backed expeditions walked the soggy fields around La Venta and San Lorenzo and started cataloguing a civilization that predated the classic Maya by centuries. Over the decades, archaeologists such as Michael D. Coe, Richard A. Deal and Ciphers, David C. Grove, and Rebecca Gonzalez-Lauck mapped systems and built chronologies, and the outlines snapped into a story. Formative, urban centers, long-distance trade, rulers who loved basalt, and rituals that shaped the Mesoamerican mind for 2 millennia. The heads deliver the drama first. 17 are known so far. 10 from San Lorenzo, 4 from La Venta, 2 from Tres Zapotes, and 1 from La Cobata. Heights run from roughly 1.5 to 3.4 meters. Weights push into the 10-40-ton range. Their basalt came from the Tuxtla Mountains, particularly Cerro Sintepec, and the fact that they ended up in riverine plains, 60 to 150 kilometers away, says more about logistics than myth. Transport likely involved teams with ropes, levers, wood rollers, and rafts, using rivers as highways. These were not stray boulders pulled by magical creatures. They were purposeful, planned moves by a society that could choreograph labor, feed specialists, and time river levels to seasonal cycles. Each head is a portrait, with individual headdresses, ears pulls, and facial details that match a real person. Stirling called them portraits in the 1940s, and the consensus has only grown stronger. The helmets are not proof of a sports league logo. They carry iconography of rule. These are rulers, looking at their people forever, fixed in stone and anchored to platforms that once held palaces. A scholar ciphers excavations at San Lorenzo show the heads often rested in elite precincts, paired with altars and drains, part of a layout that bakes political theatre into architecture. Then comes the move that flips a classroom fight into a cultural lesson. The rounded lips and broad noses on the heads do not indicate African origins. Afrocentric diffusion theories. The parachute in ancient mariners have been addressed for decades, and the evidence points to indigenous Mesoamerican faces carved in an indigenous Mesoamerican style, using local basalt, linked to local iconography, and mixed with local political stories. No transatlantic travelers are required. The heads match other Olmec art from the same workshops. Their quarry is right there in the tuxedos, and their subjects wear gear that shows up on other monuments with clearly local meaning. Strong features are not a passport stamp. They are a design choice and a power statement. Portraiture slides into propaganda on the altars, which are not benches for looking at birds but throne platforms for staging speeches, rituals, and the public display of authority. Laventa's altar 4 shows a figure emerging from a cave-like mouth, rope in hand, connecting him to the world of captives or ancestors. Those opening moors are portals to the underworld, the kind of imagery later Maya kings love so much they cover entire temples with it. Olmec rulers sit on the threshold of the cosmos, like they own the lease. The city plans reinforce it. Laventa aligns its main axis a few degrees west of true north. That tiny tilt had meaning. Archaeologist Ivan Sprajek and his collaborators used LiDAR to map hundreds of early ceremonial complexes across southern Mexico and found that many, including sites in the Olmec heartland, aligned to the sun's position on specific dates, separated by 260 days. That 260-day cycle becomes the ritual calendar across Mesoamerica. The Maya Tzolk'in, the Nahua Tomalpahuali. The recent LiDAR-based studies published by Sprach, Takeshi Inomata, and colleagues between 2020 and 2023 lay out the pattern with brutal clarity. Before the classic Maya fills stelae with glyphs, builders in the Olmec world orient plazas to a rhythm that later priests treat as sacred time. Orientation is not just feng shui. It is a calendar in clay. Calendars matter because they turn ritual into schedule. Farmers can watch a ritual clock to time planting and harvest. Priests can anchor festivals in predictable windows. Elites can tie power to cycles that look like the sky's personal to-do list. In Mesoamerica, that sense of cosmic order becomes a standard operating system. Olmec builders give the os its first big install. Rubber makes the os fun. The word Olmec comes from the Nahuatl term Olmeca, meaning people from the rubber region, and the name sticks because the Gulf lowlands grow Castilla elastica, the rubber tree, where archaeological quadrupeds, sealed in anaerobic conditions, wooden bust, infant bones, jade axes, and rubber balls dating between roughly 1600 and 1200 bars. Those balls, some in the 10 to 22 centimeter range, are the earliest physical evidence of a game that later Aztec lords bet their estates on, and even Roman tourists comment about when they watch rubber bounce in 16th century Europe. Engineers in ancient Veracruz did not just collect sap and hope for the best. Experimental work by Dorothy Hostler and colleagues in 1999 demonstrated that mixing latex with the juice of the morning glory vine boosts elasticity and durability. The chemistry is ancient polymer science, and it predates Charles Goodyear by something like 3,000 years. The earliest formal ball court discovered so far is at Paso de la Armada in Chiapas, around 1650 linked to the Moquaya culture, which shares a neighborhood and timeline with early Olmec. The Heartland keeps the rubber technology and bundles it with iconography. The game's religious pedigree gets an upgrade as it moves through Olmec hands. Later Maya myths about hero twins, underworld lords, and a ball game between life and death feel like a classic era epic produced on a script template that was already old by 400 B. The rubber and the ritual fuse into spectacle. Stadiums will roar across Mesoamerica for centuries. Jade turns that roar into a whisper of wealth. Jadeite sources concentrate in the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala, which means the Olmec are not carving local stone when they polish green masks into mirror-smooth perfection. They are trading hundreds of kilometers through river and overland routes. Laventa's offering 4 is a masterclass in subtlety. 16 miniature stone figurines and 6 polished celts set in a sand-filled pit, arranged in a tableau that archaeologists Philip Drucker, Robert Heiser, and Heiser's team uncovered in the 1950s. It is a miniature council meeting, or a ritual scene, frozen and buried, then covered, then left as a permanent enchantment under the city floor. The green is not an accident. In Mesoamerica, green stands for maize, life, and rain. The Olmec hoard it like kings hoard portraits, then bury it like insurance policies for the cosmos. Jade is only one piece of a luxury toolkit. Magnetite and hematite become mirrors with brilliant polish. Obsidian from highland Puebla and Oaxaca, and bond shows up in Gulf lowland towns. A glassy black blade wrapped in caravans and exchange networks. Iron ore mirrors focus sunlight well enough to start fires. On ceremonial days, an Olmec priest could light a brazier with a flash of light, like a magician whose trick is physics. That trick echoes into later rituals across Mesoamerica, as scholars such as Carl Taub and John E. Clark have noted. A polished mirror in the hands of a high-status figure becomes a portable horizon. The art that surrounds those mirrors carries a bestiary both fierce and intelligent. Scholars group the iconography into snarling bundles. The so-called Olmec dragon with flame eyebrows and gator traits, the bird monster with hooked beak, the fish monster with barbed fins, and the enigmatic jaguar baby with a cleft head and downturned mouth. That last label, coined in the 20th century, has been argued over for decades. It does not mean the Olmec believed in comic book shapeshifters. It reflects an ancient fascination with jaguar power and rain maze deities that often blend human infant forms and feline features. Peter Joralemmon's iconographic catalogue gives the set structure, and later critiques show that myths shift over time. The point is simpler. Olmec artists invent a visual language that later cultures use and evolve, from Maya maze gods with foliated heads to Aztec rain lords who still wear the thunder-eyed brow. Caves and mountains become stages for this language far from the lowlands. Proof that style travelled. At Chalcatzingo in Morelos, a highland ridge city with an Olmec-inspired flair, a monumental bas-relief known as Monument 1 shows a figure seated in a cave mouth as clouds and rain symbols swirl. The relief dates to around 700 to 500 BC. At Oxtotitlan in Guerrero, paintings that include a plumed serpent glide across cave walls in a hand that clearly knows the Gulf lowland style, likely late in the early formative or into the middle formative. Tia Pantequanetlan, also in Guerrero, builds a ball court and carves maze gods in stone around 1200-850 BC. These are not provincial copies. They are creative, regional conversations. The mother culture versus sister culture debate, a perennial favorite for history fights, is less useful than the map. By 900 BC, an Olmec horizon style ripples through the highlands and Pacific coast, and local elites use it to announce that they belong to a club that can speak to the cosmos. Writing lurks in this story, like a graffiti tag that keeps appearing on new walls. The most controversial piece is the Cascal block, a serpentine tablet discovered near the site of Lomas de Tacamachapa and published in 2006 by Nerea del Carmen, Rodriguez Martinez, and a team including Ponciano, Ortiz Ceballos, and Michael Coe. The block carries 62 incised signs in sequences that repeat and stack, and the fill that contained it dates to around 900 B. Not all scholars accept it as writing. Even skeptics agree It is at least a formal sign system tied to ritual and elite display. A separate line of evidence is less controversial. At San Andres, 5 kilometers from La Venta, Mary Pole and her colleagues reported a cylinder seal and sherds with glyph-like signs, including a day name similar to 3 Aja, dating to around 650 bars. That day name belongs to the 260 day calendar's set of 20-day signs. By the late formative and into the early classic, the Olmec, or Isthmian script, shows up in full narrative glory on La Modera Stella 1, discovered in Veracruz and dated to 156, and on other monuments, such as Tres Zapotes, Stella C, and Chiapa de Corzo Stella 2, which hold some of the earliest long count dates known in the 36-32 batch range, depending on correlation. This cluster is not the Maya script yet, but it shows that the Isthmus region carried a tradition of writing and counting time that set the stage for later Maya epic inscriptions. Numbers have their own charisma. The 260 day count is paired with the 365 day solar year across Mesoamerica, and together they make a 52-year calendar round, a cycle that later Aztecs celebrate with new fire ceremonies. Long count dates roll forward from a mythic creation to tag events with astronomical precision. The earliest reliable long count markers, including Tres Zapotes Stella C's backside inscription and Chiapa de Corzo Stella 2, live in or near the Olmec and Epi-Olmec world. The isthmus becomes a lab for time as power. The food that fuels it all tastes familiar and exotic at once. Maize is the backbone, domesticated earlier in highland Mexico, but powering the diets of formative lowland cities through milpa systems that rotate maize, beans, and squash. San Andres shows microfossil evidence of maize and even of manioc, a starchy root that thrives in wet soils and adds calories in a humid world. A more liquid revelation comes from cacao. John S. Henderson, Rosemary Joyce, and then John Powys and colleagues pushed the timeline back when chemical tests revealed theobromine residues, the chemical signature of cacao in pots from Gulf lowland sites. A 2011 PM Hey Mess paper by Powys and team reported cacao residues at San Lorenzo, dating to at least 1750 B. This puts chocolate in the Olmec pantry and the Olmec temple, whether in fermented drinks, porridge-thick concoctions, or spicy ceremonial brews. Later Maya and Aztec elites keep calling cacao food of the gods. The recipe starts earlier than many expected, in the shadow of basalt heads. Engineering deserves its own round of applause. San Lorenzo's basalt drain system is not a rumor. Excavations led by Ann Cyphers and earlier by Coe and Deal documented U-shaped channels, drain boxes, and stone-lined spillways set under plazas and elite compounds. Water emerges from carved jaguar or serpent mouths, moving ritual and utility in the same pipeline. The road network looks different when the road is a river. The Coatzacoalcos, the Tonalá, the San Juan. These rivers act like highways for timber rafts and cargo canoes. Clay, earth, and stone rise into platforms and pyramids, with the La Venta's Great Pyramid built from perhaps 100,000 cubic meters of clay arranged with fluted sides like a giant bundt cake for rain gods. Mosaic pavements made from hundreds of rectangular serpentine blocks form massive, buried masks, laid out, admired briefly, then covered forever. That is not waste. That is choreography. Ritual that vanishes immediately and intentionally, like spiritual fireworks. Then comes the part that usually triggers a how did they do that moment, without anyone needing to ask it out loud. Moving a 30-ton basalt head from Cerro Sintepec to San Lorenzo demands planning, people, and patience. 1,000 workers hauling with ropes and levers across levees to a riverbank is a plausible scene. Lash the carved core to a timber raft. Wait for high water. Pole and paddle your way downstream at a slow, steady rate, maybe 10 to 20 kilometers in a day on current, more with favorable flow. Offload to a causeway of logs and earthen ramps. Drag uphill with teams swapping in and out. No steel, no wheel, but no hurry either. The head arrives and outlasts the tools by 3,000 years. Ancient engineering scales. When time is on your side, politics leaves marks in stone besides portraits and drains. San Lorenzo's sculptures suffered mutilation and relocation around 900 BIs. Faces were defaced. Monuments were buried upright in new locations. The act reads as a regime change performed like a ritual. The city then fades as the Coatzacoalcos River shifts course and local ecology changes, perhaps starving the network of the leverage it used to grow. La Venta ascends as a new central place and curates its own gallery of altars, heads, and offerings. Around 400 bis, the big center there also declines, maybe under pressure from shifting trade routes, resource strain, or new centers rising to the west. The Olmec world does not vanish. It evolves into epi-Olmec cultures along the Papaloapan and lower Coatzacoalcos. Tres Zapotes keeps carving. Ischimian scribes keep writing. Other regions pick up the baton and sprint. That sprint looks like Monte Alban, rising in the Oaxaca highlands, around 500 beach, with carved danzante stones of captured enemies, and one of the earliest distinctive scripts in Mesoamerica. It looks like Izapa blossoming on the Pacific coast, with stelae that tell mythic stories in a visual grammar that whispers Olmec and shouts early Maya. It looks like the Maya heartland exploding with inscriptions and calendar dates by the classic period. Dynasties claiming divine descent, kings emerging from serpent mouths, and maize gods with cleft heads unfurling leaves. It looks like Teotihuacan engineering apartment compounds for a metropolis and exporting power and ritual to the Maya lowlands. The Olmec toolkit spreads. Rulers on thrones, stelae with histories, jade as theology, calendars as control, and later empires bolt on new modules. The ballgame grows from a regional passion into an international league. Maya kings sponsor teams and stage captives for public drama. Rubber balls thump against sloped walls. Courts sink into the heart of cities. Nobles wear yokes not as gear, but as stone symbols of sacrifice and prestige. The game remains flexible. Some matches stand in for cosmological battles. Others settle diplomatic grudges. The Olmec contribution is not the first court everywhere. It is the chemistry, the sacred symbolism, and the momentum. The game arrives to later centuries, already carrying obligation. Religion and state policy mix early. Offerings buried in complex patterns stack artifacts into cosmograms. Quincunx arrangements with 4 points and a center map the universe onto the ground. Celts, those polished jade axes, stop being tools long before they enter the pits at La Venta. They become green rays of theology. Rulers play with blood and stingray spines as part of rituals, a practice attested archaeologically in the formative by caches of blades and spines. Later Maya rulers pull cords through tongues, viscerally repeats early logics. No written Olmec myth explains the world in verse the way the Popol Vuh will for the kitsch. The images make the logic public anyway. Caves are wombs and portals. Mountains are thrones. Jaguars are night power. Babies are maize power. Rain is a deity who negotiates tribute in blood and incense. That exchange extends to sound and light. Mirrors catch sun and shine it back. Shell trumpets boom across plazas. Dancers wear costumes loaded with noisemakers. Archaeologists recover costumes in fragments and reconstruct the soundscape. Rattles, flutes, drumheads. A public festival at La Venta would have been a multi-sensory event loaded with movement and choreographed for maximum impact. Smoke pours from copal incense. Chocolate froths. Rubber burns slightly sweet if it catches a coal. Monumental sculpture stands silent, but stares people into awe. The experience wires memory. Later cultures remember how a city should feel when it enters another world. A quirk in the map becomes a superpower. The Gulf lowlands sit like a funnel, where highland obsidian, lowland cotton, tropical feathers, cocoa, salt, and even ideas such as writing and calendar making pass back and forth. Gulf Coast communities plug into that flow and begin to standardize aesthetics and ritual forms that other elites recognize. Style is currency. Owning a greenstone mask carved in a Gulf workshop signals membership in a shared moral universe. A highland ruler who installs an Olmec-style altar announces that he understands rulership as a cosmic office. Ideas circulate as reliably as goods. Gulf lowland lords act as cultural brokers, trading in intangibles that last longer than any single dynasty. The Discovery timeline shows that modern fascination follows the same currents. Early reports saw the heads, loved the drama, and promptly invented migrations. The science corrected course with dates and quarries. The Momvises fight over who gets to be the first civilization in Mesoamerica, boiled down to a false choice that ignored the messy brilliance of regional networks. Michael Coe popularized the concept of an Olmec mother culture in the 1960s and 1970s. Later scholars pointed out that the Zapotec, Mochaya, and early Maya were innovating at the same time. The truth sits between slogans. Olmec centers act as seedbeds for a shared Mesoamerican civilizational package, while other regions plant their own seedbeds. Multiple cradles, same ecosystem. That ecosystem needs constant myth busting. No ancient astronauts floated basalt to La Venta. No transatlantic fleets dropped off carvers with exotic last names. These were indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica who mastered wetlands, read the sky, and built on their ancestors' experiments until they could schedule a festival to the day using a calendar with no leap years and move 30-ton boulders downstream without cracking them. The heads look exotic because they are not modern portraits. They are ancient political billboards carved by people who understood faces as fields of claims. Put a headdress on a face and a rope in a hand, and you have a king who owes the sun a favor. Evidence cares about details. Population estimates are conservative because wetlands do not love deep stratigraphy. San Lorenzo at its peak probably held in the 10,000 to 13,000 range, depending on which survey gets cited, with more people in hinterland villages. La Venta may have matched or exceeded that by the middle formative, clustering elites and craftsmen on raised platforms and moving commoners into surrounding areas. These are big numbers for a region that floods every year and requires daily negotiation with crocodiles. They are also perfect for a sphere of influence model. Many people lived outside the big centers, but made pilgrimages in for festivals, trade, and law. The law part looks different without written edicts. Stone carries the Constitution. Altar 4 or 5 is a charter for how to rule. Offering 4 is a contract for how the cosmos gets paid. A basalt drain that runs under a royal residence is a policy memorandum written in water. When invaders or rivals topple altars and mutilate heads, they rewrite the Constitution with stone chisels. At San Lorenzo, that kind of revision happened in a cascade. Statues of seated rulers were recarved into heads. Water monuments were buried. A new age demanded new theatre. The Olmec script, if the Cascajal block and San Andres seal count as steps in a tradition, adds an extra layer. When a cylinder seal at San Andres prints a day name like 3 Agile, it turns the calendar into a personal signature. Aja, later the Maya word for Lord, cycles through a week-like rotation of 20-day names. Attach a number, and it pings the 260 day clock like a timestamp. The moment belongs to someone. Later, scribes run with the idea and build histories out of lists of Ajor names and conquest counts. The Epi-Olmec scribes of the Isthmus carve extended passages on La Morjara, Stela 1, that include long count dates and narrative content in a script that epigraphers such as Terence Kaufman and John Justison have argued is decipherable. The debate continues. The existence of the writing does not. An Isthmian tradition of marking time and recording elite events existed in the centuries after Leventa's heyday, and almost certainly grew from earlier Gulf lowland practices. Water and sacred geography stay glued together. San Lorenzo's drains do more than drain. They carry created meaning, channeling liquid through sculptures with crocodilian and jaguar features as if the underworld's rivers flow right under the palace floor. Leventa's pyramid sits on a north-south axis, aligned with solar events that articulate the 260 day cycle. This is the first big show of what archaeologists such as Anthony Aveni later document all over Mesoamerica, cities aligned to points where sunrise and sunset frame sacred time. Priests can step into a plaza, watch the sun hit a place between 2 markers, and announce a feast. The city becomes a calendar you can walk on. And then there is the way jade behaves under a knife. Gulf lowland workshops produce masks so thin that light shines through the edges. Jade celts with polish, so smooth that every collector since the 1500s has wanted them. And pendants that look like babies crossed with jaguars, in poses that feel simultaneously tender and terrifying. Those forms do not vanish when the big centers collapse. They reappear centuries later, reinterpretations still tied to power. The Maya bury greenstone offerings across the classic era. Aztec emperors write about Quetzalcoatl and the ancient towns of the Gulf. The memory of powerful people on the wet coast lingers in myth. A few favorite pieces sum up the mood. Leventa's massive offering, 2 more than 485 blocks of serpentine, set as a rectangular mosaic, then buried under a plaza. Builders created art, designed never to be seen, as if the gods needed a private installation. Leventa's Complex A, a cluster of platforms north of the pyramid with multiple offerings and alignments, turning Earth into an engine of ceremony. San Lorenzo's Monument 1, a seated baby figure with a grown jaw that glints with feral energy, a reminder that status might be inherited, but not without dangerous work. Not everything romanticizes neatly. Those infants among the El Manati offerings are not dolls. They are human remains of babies, placed at a sacred spring, where their bones mineralized in a place the Olmec considered alive. A modern ear registers the horror first. An ancient ear hears obligations. Water negotiates life and death with a community that sees rain as person. The same logic returns across Mesoamerica. Rain gods always collect their dues. Understanding the Olmec cultural impact means resisting the urge to sanitize how that impact landed. This is also where everyday life deserves stage time. The Olmec are not only priests, lords, and athletes. They are farmers working milpas in heat that pushes 30 degrees Celsius by noon. They are fishers who know where the river drops into channels, full of catfish and gar. They are women grinding maize on stone metates and trading shell beads over distances that would exhaust modern shoppers. They are artisans firing hollow ceramic figurines with the famous infantine style that collectors chase and archaeologists contextualize. Some of these figurines have holes for breath or voice, as if they were parts of rituals that needed sound. They are households that stack dirt into platforms so floods will not destroy a year of work, matching seasonal labor to life cycles. This behind-the-scenes complexity underwrites the theaters of power. Scholars often emphasize rain, maize, jaguars, and caves, and that shorthand works as a bumper sticker. The fuller picture is a society that produced consistent, cross-regional symbols of legitimacy and set the stage for an entire macro-region's shared language of power. Later rulers could speak to multi-ethnic audiences without translators because they could point to a cave-mouth throne and everyone understood. Mesoamerica becomes a zone where cosmic narratives and statecraft use the same symbols. The Olmec are where that grammar snaps into form. The line connecting Olmec culture to later classic and post-classic worlds can be traced in specific artifacts. Take feathers and serpents. A plumed serpent graces cave walls at Oxtotitlan and Las Pinturas in Guerrero. By Novecentos Cuatrocientos Beck, that image reappears as Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl among later Maya and Aztec. The forms change, the meanings evolve, but the core pairing of wind, sky, and serpentine power runs on a long track. Or take rulers emerging from the mouths of giant monsters. Leventa's altars show it. Maya kings at Yaxchilan and Copan, reenacted in stone centuries later. Or take the 260 day calendar stamped on San Andres and baked into site orientations in the Gulf. Maya scribes refine it into a system that can predict eclipses and back-calculate creation. The Olmec saw that a count that fits human gestation has a power to organize ritual life. Later mathematicians turn that hunch into an exact system. The conversation also runs back in time, from the 20th century. The term Olmec is an exonym from the Aztec era that refers to Gulf Coast people who harvested rubber in the post-classic. Scholars applied the name retroactively to an older culture grounded in the same region, because the monuments and sites piled up in Veracruz and Tabasco. The original people did not leave a name printed on a sign. Modern scholarship carries that humility when it can, even as it uses the term as a practical handle. That decision matters, because it keeps the story attached to a real place and ensures that modern communities in Veracruz and Tabasco see the deep roots under their feet. All heritage is local first. There is a reason, later, Central Mexican histories talk about ancient people of the Gulf Coast with reverence and anxiety. Power came from the wetlands when central Mexico was still small. The Aztecs sent Pocteca, elite merchants, to the lowlands for rubber, cotton, cacao, and jade, long after La Venta's platforms had melted back into hills of clay. They also told stories about old rulers who knew how to marshal storms. That reputation does not die easily. Modern technology keeps rewriting the footnotes. Dialer surveys carried out over the past decade have stripped the forest canopy away on computer screens and revealed hundreds of rectangular platforms and ceremonial complexes across Tabasco, Veracruz, southern Campeche, and the Usumacinta Basin. Aguada Phoenix, a gigantic earthen platform near the Guatemala-Mexico border, turned out to be older than expected, around 1,800 BC, with a layout that shares features with lowland Olmec centers. Inomata and colleagues argued in Nature, in 2020, the monumentality at this scale began earlier and more broadly than many had assumed. The hero of the story is not a single city. It is a network of builders who agreed on a cosmological urbanism that measured the year in east-west light. That cosmological urbanism merged with the daily grind in ways that feel modern. Ritual demanded logistics. Incense had supply chains. Jade came via contracts. Stone quarries had procurement schedules. In short, the Olmec turned faith into policy and policy into architecture. Their cultural impact is visible because they made architecture do cultural work. Even after Laventa's pyramid slumps into a low hill, its orientation still lines up with specific sunsets across the horizon. Even after the heads are toppled, they stare with a farmer's stubbornness into the humidity and insist that power is heavy and durable. A few myths sit on the curb and wave for attention. They benefit from one more reality check. The Olmec did not vanish. Cultural continuity flows through the Epi-Olmec. Zapotes keeps carving big stone late into the 1st century by. Long count dates in the Isthmus region show literate elites marking time with the same numbers that later Maya kings use. The region remains politically relevant into the Classic period, with ties to the Central Highlands and the Maya world. The Olmec did not invent every Mesoamerican tradition either. The first ball court is Moquaya at Paso de la Armada. The first dense dynastic writing system blooms among the Maya. The lesson is not monopoly, it is acceleration. The Olmec world accelerates the coalescence of a shared civilizational grammar. Olmec research has had some of archaeology's best plot twists. Matthew Stirling's 1940s excavations brought the heads to global attention. Miguel Covarrubias, a genius of modern Mexican art, drew the Olmec with such love that he helped launch a generation of scholars. Michael Coe bridged rigorous scholarship and vivid storytelling in the late 20th century. And Sisyphus's long-term work at San Lorenzo added data to the drainage and sculpture sequences. Rebecca González Lauch's leadership at Laventa tightened dates and contexts. Mary Paul's San Andres project-linked glyphs to pottery residues and proved that day signs were in use, centuries before classic Maya inscriptions. And Marta's LiDAR teams reminded everyone that forests hide patterns that eyes on the ground cannot see. Each wave of science has pulled one more curtain, back on a story that refuses to sit still. The best part of the Olmec impact is how much of it still feels tactile. A greenstone bead, drilled with staggering precision, fits the hand the same way it did in 800 B. A basalt head sets a mood just by being there. A rubber ball held to the nose smells faintly like plant and smoke if it has seen a fire. A mosaic mask buried under a plaza looks like a god's calling card, even if no one sees it. Earthen pyramids feel solid and warm after rain. The wetland breeze carries river music and bird calls just like it did when the first rulers sat down on altars and announced that they were going to speak for the sky. Some viewers love clean origin stories. The Olmec resist being made into a single Ur civilization. They fit better as founding members of a regional league who arrived early, designed the logo, commissioned the first jerseys, and taught everyone the rules. Later, teams took the sport to new heights. The Olmec still get a banner in the rafters because they made the game recognizable. Calendars tick in 260. Day cycles, because early lowland architects line their cities with that rhythm. Ball games thud across centuries because someone near San Lorenzo learned to lace vines into latex until bounce happened. Jade means sacred because they said so with offerings big enough to bury a house. The exact numbers keep the myth honest. 17 heads, 4 at Laventa, 10 at San Lorenzo, 2 at Tres Zapotes, 1 at La Cabata. Laventa's pyramid, at about 33 meters, built from earth, not stone. El Manatee's rubber balls from the 16th to 12th centuries bar. San Andres day signs around 650 bars. Cascal block around 900 bis. Chapa de Corzo and Tres Zapotes. Long count in the 36, 32 barge range. Epi Olmec la Mojara Stella, one dated to 156. Sprague and Inamata's LiDAR mapping of hundreds of complexes oriented between 1100 and 750 B. These are not fuzzy claims. They are coordinates on a map that is clicked into focus. Culture is a machine that outlives its builders. The Olmec built a machine with rituals, cities, images, and time counts that kept running long after their capitals faded. Later, Maya kings step into that machine and crank it to 11. Aztec poets write metaphors with parts salvaged from it. Colonial chroniclers interview ritual specialists who still carry echoes of it. When people today walk into museums in Jalapa, Villahermosa, Mexico City, or Los Angeles, and stand in front of those heads, the gaze does the same work it did before iron smelted anywhere in the Americas. It whispers that power is heavy, sacred time is real, and the rain will remember who paid on time. Archaeology always wants a final reveal, and the Olmec insist on dozens. The next monsoon season will shift a riverbank and cough up another monument. The next LiDAR dataset will draw a rectangle on a screen and connect it to a sunrise no one realized the builders could see. The next chemical test will find a smudge of theobromine where no one thought chocolate belonged that early. A green stone will come out of a house foundation 500 kilometers from the coast and will match the Motagua Valley by geochemistry. Proof that LCMs, long-distance cultural messages, move without Wi-Fi. The cultural impact of the Olmec civilization is measured in calendars still counted, games still played, gods still recognizable, and cities still aligned to a sky that works on its own schedule. The swamp that carved a civilization into clay and basalt did not produce a footnote. It produced an operating system. Other peoples logged in and made it their own. The login screen still reads Gulf Coast. Formative period between 1500 and 400 BC. Press start when the sun lines up with the plaza. The system boots into greenstone, rubber, water, and time. The images load as jaguars and babies with cloud eyebrows. The soundtrack opens with drums and wind roaring through a serpent's stone mouth. Museum lighting flatters the details, but these monuments were born outdoors. The jungle did not hide history. It kept the show running until someone was ready to sit in the humidity and listen. That is the real fascination. The Olmec built culture that acts like weather. It moves through space, saturates everything, and then clears up, leaving seeds behind. Later cultures sprout from those seeds and produce new storms. The heads are not trophies. They are weather vanes, turning once toward rulers who claimed lightning for themselves, and now toward viewers who finally understand the joke. Power is heavy. Time is a habit. Art does not apologize for being serious. The oldest cities in the region measured the year with mud brick plazas and ball courts. Later dynasties measured history with stelae and wars. The origin zone measured culture with the hardest medium of all, assault, and then dared rain and heat to erase it. The rain failed. The faces stayed. The calendar counted. The ball bounced. The gods listened. The neighbors took notes. And the world that formed between the Papaloapan and the Coatzacoalcos taught Mesoamerica how to turn swamps into stories and stories into systems that last. A wave slaps a limestone quay on the Levantine coast, and the smell hits first. Sea salt, fish guts, and a sharp, oddly sweet stench that clings to everything. The Murex workshops of Tyre and Sidon pump out Tyrian purple, like a luxury perfume made from a swamp. Barrels, amphorae, bundles of cedar planks, sacks of grain and resin, and coils of rope crowd the docks. Sailors curse in at least 5 languages. A scribe perches on a crate and scratches symbols on a sherd of broken pottery, not chiseling monumental pictographs or summoning priests to decode royal thunderbolts. Just 22 brisk signs, lined up right to left, quick as a grocery list. In that moment, the Mediterranean gets a new operating system. He looks like a nobody, sunburned, ink-stained, holding a reed pen. But he is part of the reason an entire sea learns to talk to itself. No throne room, no clay table bureaucracy, no gold-plated archive. Just a handheld kit, ink, papyrus, and an alphabet lean enough to fit in a pocket, and mean enough to muscle aside older writing systems like a street vendor, capturing a market from a luxury boutique. The Phoenician alphabet doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with cargo. This is the story of how 22 letters, Aleph through Tor, slid into Mediterranean trade the way a nimble ship cuts between lumbering galleys. It is not a tale of emperors. It is a tale of invoices, tin, wine, purple dye, and the strangest prayer campaign in history. The one where legends credit the wrong people while the right people keep sailing. Start with the baseline. Before these coastal traders, from Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Arwad, put their stamp on writing, communication across distance runs through gatekeepers. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia clocks in with hundreds of signs, often over 600 in late Bronze Age usage. Training a scribe is a decade-long life choice. Egyptian hieroglyphs and hieratic shorthand, same story. Dense, sacred, adjacent, guarded by temple and court. Contracts exist, ledgers exist, bills of lading exist, but ownership of literacy tilts toward palaces. Knowledge is powerful, and powerful people keep it on a leash. Then the late Bronze Age collapses like a rotten pier around 1200 BC. Palaces burn, sea routes scramble, whole kingdoms vanish from the receipts. The survivors along the Levantine coast adapt. They keep shipyards busy, keep yard cells steaming, keep cedar moving, and they simplify the code that tracks it all. Instead of one symbol for cow, another for cattle, a third for cattle in the possessive, and a fourth for cattle when the moon is waxing. They ride the insight that a limited set of consonant sounds can be recombined infinitely. 22 characters, all consonants. An abjad. Vowels stay mostly implied, because Semitic languages can handle that. A quick infrastructure change means a massive social shift. More people can learn to write, and they can learn fast. There is a prequel, and the prequel matters. Alphabetic thinking doesn't emerge from nowhere. People in the Sinai scribbled Proto-Semitic signs at Serebet el-Kadim around the 19th to 15th centuries BAS, leaving scrolls that riff on Egyptian hieroglyphic shapes. Further south in Egypt, the Wadi el-Hol inscriptions, dated roughly to the 19th-18th centuries by, whisper the same idea. A small set of signs capturing consonantal sounds. Over in Ugarit, on the Syrian coast around the 14th century BAS, scribes press an alphabetic cuneiform into clay with 3 0-ish wedges. So the alphabet as a concept has been hovering. What changes with the Phoenicians is not raw invention, but standardization and distribution. The alphabet becomes a tool that fits the hands of sailors and merchants and crosses borders as easily as amphorae of wine. So no, the Phoenicians do not invent writing. Sumerians beat everyone to it by a couple thousand years. Chinese script grows up entirely on its own path. Mesoamerica does its own thing. But the Phoenicians turn the alphabet from clever to contagious. They strip it down, make it portable, and then sell the idea by accident while selling everything else on purpose. The letters themselves read like a tour of the barn. Aleph, the ox; Beth, the house; Gimel, the camel; Daleth, the door; He, the window; War, the hook; Sayin, a weapon; Heth, a fence; Teth, a wheel or a mark; Yod, the hand; Homan, Kaf, the palm; Lamd, a goad; Mem, water; Nun, fish; Same, support; Ayin, eye; P, mouth; Tsard, a sprout or hunt; Korf, the back of the head; Rish, head; Shin, tooth; Tor, mark. The ink runs right to left. Matraslexinos, letters like war and yod, sometimes hint at long vowels later on, but the core stays lean. 22. No royal flourish, no mystical flourish. Just a toolkit. A timeline helps to keep the drama grounded. Around 1050, 950 Bas. Inscriptions from Byblos show the script in a form a modern scholar can comfortably call Phoenician. The Aharam sarcophagus at Byblos, usually dated to around the 10th century Bas, carries an epitaph that already looks like the standard system. The Yayimilk inscription from Byblos, same general era, reads like a dedication from a king to a temple. Civic prior with a timeless tone. He gave, the god blessed, the city flourished. The script spreads quickly, to Cyprus at Kishan, to Sardinia, to Malta, to Sicily, to Spanish coasts, the way trade beads and amphora stamps follow anchorages. Merchants write funerary lines, and temple, thank yous, but they also jot down more disposable notes that rarely survive. Paperwork existed, but papyrus dies young, in damp tombs. One chunk of survival bias should be kept in full view. Temple and stone survive. Shipping receipts often do not. The ancient world plays favorites. Tea-light votives in a shrine will outlast warehouse ledgers every time. That skews the record and hides the most ordinary use of this script. 100 small entries for 100 small transactions. The real bloodstream of trade. Some names come in loud and clear anyway. The Nora stone from Sardinia, probably 9th century BC, is an early Western Phoenician inscription. Short, battered, and foundational. The Karatate bilingual inscription from Cilicia in the 8th century BC carries both Phoenician and hieroglyphic Luwian and reads like a victory lap for local King Azatiwada. The Eshmunazar II sarcophagus out of Sidon, 5th century BC, delivers a full-throated curse against tomb robbers, complete with franchise rights to divine vengeance. The Kippi of Melkart from Malta, 2nd century Beth, provide a bilingual Greek-Phoenician inscription that later scholars used the way a decoder ring gets used. Aligning vocabulary, aligning gods, aligning worlds. The Pyrgi tablets around 500 Bes in Etruria hold a Phoenician, Testarte, from a local ruler of Caere. These are the monuments. The paper trail of shipping lies mostly in the dust. On the docks, the alphabet does exactly what a trade network needs, a system that takes a few weeks to learn. Instead of a decade, lets ship captains keep their own tallies and scribes, work across languages. Ledger lines become faster to draw and easier to teach. Weights and measures slot into neat columns. The ubiquitous shekel, as a weight rather than a coin, slides across the scales in Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Standards vary by city and era, but think roughly 714 grams per shekel depending on local practice. The point is consistency and notation. Mark a jar with a merchant's seal and a quick alphabetic tag, and suddenly an amphora can shout its origin, contents, and owner from the warehouse shelf. Archaeologists later dig up jar handles, stamped with names and letters, like someone left a barcode gun running for centuries. It helps to watch the goods write the letters. Tyrian purple, the attention-grabbing, nose-offending dye, fuels an entire industry and produces mountains of murex shells at coastal sites. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, describes the extraction process and its insane cost in Natural History 9.60 and elsewhere. That dye can involve tens of thousands of shells for enough pigment to trim the hem of a single garment. He reports that the final product can be so expensive that only senators and emperors dare to wrap themselves in it, and for good reason. The chemistry checks out. 6,6-dipyromendigo, stabilized via sunlight and salt, yields the color. Workshop piles at sites like Sidon, Tyre, Shikmona, near modern Haifa, and Meninx on Jerba tell the rest of the story without a single surviving purchase order. The mess is the receipt. Cedar of Lebanon travels south to Egypt and east to Mesopotamia as a prestige timber. The Amarna letters in the 14th century Bar already talk about Byblos shipping wood, long before the Phoenician script stabilizes. Glassware from Sidon, wine from the Levant packed in pointed bottom amphorae, designed to nestle swords straight into ship holds, oil from the hills, carved ivory, silver from Iberian mines, lead ingots stamped with marks. The Mazarone too shipwreck off the coast of Spain, 8th-7th century Bas, preserves a small Phoenician merchantman built with pegged mortise and tenon joinery. It is a time capsule of nautical technique and trade practice. A hull assembled shell first, planks locked together like a floating jigsaw puzzle. That construction method spreads across the Mediterranean and holds until Rome starts building skeleton first centuries later. The alphabet rides with the joinery, as fundamental and as portable. The network sprawls like grapevines. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century Bash, credits the Phoenicians with wandering all over the sea and casually mentions that those who came with Cadmus brought letters to Greece. He names them Phoenician letters because that is what they were called at the time. He also relays a wild report that Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa for Pharaoh Necho around 600 BC, noticing that the sun stood to the right, that is, north of them, an oddity that makes modern geographers nod. Myth tries to graft a hero named Cadmus onto the story, but the logistics are better evidence than the legend. Greek inscriptions explode almost immediately after sustained contact. That Greek adoption is the pivot. The Greeks pick up the 22 consonants sometime in the 8th century Bas, almost certainly via trading contacts with Phoenicians. They tweak the set, repurpose a handful of consonant symbols that Greek doesn't need. Aleph, Heon, Yod, into vowels, alpha, epsilon, omicron, iota. They import letter names, keep the order, and at first even keep the right to left flow, or switch back and forth in Boustrophrodon. The Dipylon inscription from Athens, around 740 base scrawls on a wine jug with alphabetic bragging rights. The Nestor's cup from Pitekusai on Ischia, around 730 BC, gets cheeky, with a hexameter verse scratched into the clay. This is not a slow diffusion. This is a lighting of a fuse. From Greek to Etruscan to Latin, the chain runs fast. The Euboean script variant finds a home in Cumaean Campania. Etruscans adapt it and beam it into the peninsula. Latins tweak it and march with it. By the time Rome is stamping spore on everything, the shape of letters on stone in the Forum descends by direct and simple steps from those Phoenician squiggles on coastal stones. Call it Phoenician to Greek, to Etruscan, to Latin, to everything in a modern keyboard. The names never hide it. Alphabet literally spells alpha beta. That isn't subtle. The Semitic line has its own sequel, Aramaic. The Near Eastern lingua franca of the first millennium Barsh blooms with scripts derived from the same Phoenician base. Old Hebrew inscriptions like the Sumeria Ostraka in the 8th century Bai show a script so similar to Phoenician that modern textbooks call it Paleo-Hebrew. Later, under Persian influence in the 5th to 4th centuries B, Jewish scribes adopt an Aramaic-derived square script, the one that prints Torah scrolls and textbooks today. Nabatean script evolves out of Aramaic and curls elegantly into early Arabic by late antiquity. A long line of family resemblance runs through these alphabets, all stemming from that early 22-letter kit that tidy minds organized in the Levant. Another line of influence gets proposed and then argued over in lecture halls. Brahmi, the ancestor of most South Asian scripts, shows shapes and an ordering that some scholars in the 20th century saw as influenced by Semitic models, possibly Aramaic around the 4th to 3rd centuries B. Others champion independent invention. The jury is still arguing in texts, not in tweets. What can be said safely? The Phoenician alphabet does not father everything. It fathers a very large, very consequential set. Navigation props up everything else. Phoenician and later Punic sailors steer by stars, in a way Greek and Roman writers notice and grudgingly admire. Strabo and others mention them, steering by a star in the Little Bear, sometimes called the Phoenician star, when Greeks prefer the Big Dipper. The exact identification shifts over time as precession slowly walks the North Star around the sky. The point stands. They handle night sailing with a confidence born of practice. They distribute weather wisdom like a specialized guild. When to leave Sidon to hug the coast of Syria, when to parasite the winds to Cyprus, when to cut across to Rhodes, when to give the Cape Bon currents in Tunisia the respect they demand. Route maps in the head get lined up with letters in the hand. The Periplus of Hanno, preserved in a Greek translation of a Punic original and often dated to the 5th century B, claims colonies along the Atlantic coast of North Africa, maybe all the way to the Gulf of Guinea if one reads cautiously and squints at the geography. Himilco, another Carthaginian mariner from roughly the same period, gets quoted centuries later by Avienus for voyages up the Atlantic coast toward the tin-rich islands and fog banks. The text is late and slippery, but the gist tracks the trade reality. Carthaginian and Phoenician seafarers reach out of the Strait of Gibraltar and hope the currents treat them kindly. Tin sits at the heart of 100 historical arguments because bronze demands it. Diodorus Siculus, in the 1st century Bas, reports that tin comes from islands off Britain and travels overland through Gaul to Massalia. Herodotus admits in the 5th century Bas that he doesn't know where it comes from in the far west, which counts as honesty points. A neat but unprovable story claims the Phoenicians corner the tin market in Britain and ram any intruding Roman ships onto rocks to preserve the secret. The better evidence points to Iberia as a massive source of metals, especially silver, from mines around the southwest like Rio Tinto, and a vibrant trade with Tartessos and Gadir. Modern Cadiz documented by archaeology in the 9th to 7th centuries, but copper and tin do reach the Mediterranean from farther north, but a top-secret Phoenician monopoly on British tin stays filed under romance rather than report. The colonies make their own case on their own timelines. Cadiz sits on a sandy spit with a killer harbour. Classical tradition says it was founded around 1104 Bus. Modern archaeology shifts the secure dates closer to the 9th century Bus. Motia on Sicily grows fat in the 8th to 6th centuries before Dionysius of Syracuse wipes it out in 397 Bes. Nora and Tharas in Sardinia, Lixus in Mogador on the Moroccan coast, Carthage in Tunisia. Modern scholars calibrate their dates tighter with every new trench. Carthage itself, according to the Greek historian Timaeus and others, dates to 814 BC, while archaeology again tends to tug it toward the late 9th century. The numbers shift. The pattern does not. Coastal outposts spring up where anchorages, trade partners, and convenient capes align. Carthage inherits the script and leans on it hard. Punic inscriptions advertise dedications to Tanit and Baal Hammon, record officials' names, track temple gifts. In the 5th century Bas, the Carthaginians begin minting coins, often in Sicily to pay mercenaries. Sidon and Tyre at roughly the same time, under Achaemenid Persian hegemony, strike coins with Phoenician legends and symbols like galleys and kings. The coin revolution does not begin in Phoenicia. Lydia in western Anatolia beats everyone with electrum coins in the late 7th century Bers, but Phoenician and Punic cities prove enthusiastic adopters, stamping their alphabet right onto the money. Earlier, silver by weight had functioned just fine. Now silver, with an emblem and a legend, travels as a promise. The old shekel weight becomes a coin denomination. The alphabet wedges its way into commerce again by making value legible. On every pier, the letters creep into the ordinary. Short ostraca, those pottery shared scraps, carry quick notes. Bolet, little clay lumps once wrapped around strings or reeds, bear impressions of seals and letter scratches that announce a sender or a destination. Jar handles carry stamp marks recording names and dates. In the Kingdom of Israel, the Samaria ostraca from the 8th century Bas list shipments of wine and oil with names and places, using an alphabet close to Phoenician. In Judah, the Lemel-K jars belonging to the king bear stamped legends as part of a royal supply system in the late 8th century B. These are not by the ocean Phoenician per se, but they show the alphabetic culture at work across the Levant. Tyre and Sidon sit in the same ecosystem, playing the same game, deploying the same tools. The old Hebrew Bible even memorializes Tyre's trade network in Ezekiel 27, a 6th century B time lament, dressed as a shipping inventory. It is a roll call of the Mediterranean supply chain. Tarshish sending silver, iron, tin, and lead. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech with slaves and bronze. Beth Togarmah with horses. Dedan with saddlecloths. Arabia with lambs, rams and goats. Sheba with spices. Damascus with wine and wool. Dan and Javan with wrought iron and cassia. Uzal with wrought iron, Arabia's camel traders, Sheba's gold. Whether every line is an auditor's report or a poet's flourish, the geography checks. Tyre appears in Assyrian royal inscriptions as a city that must pay tribute and open its warehouses to armies. These cities sit in the crosshairs of bigger empires and keep the traffic moving anyway. The alphabet thrives in this confusion because it lowers the cost of being precise. A bilingual treaty carved at Karatate becomes the Rosetta moment for Luwian and Phoenician. The Kippi of Melkart in Malta function like a pocket dictionary. The Pegi tablets line up Etruscan and Phoenician cult language so neatly that those 3 gold sheets earn more than their weight in scholarly publications. These are prestige artifacts. Their utility is not daily, but they show that the alphabet is adaptable and flexible, sliding into cross-cultural dealings instead of calcifying in a single priestly corner. Back in Biblos, the brand power shows up in everyday words. The Greek word for papyrus becomes biblos. Then the word for book becomes biblos. And centuries later, a collection of sacred texts takes on the name Bible. The origin story of books now runs through a port already exporting papyrus in the 2nd millennium Bas, long before anyone standardized 22 letters. The irony writes itself. Biblos gives the world the name for the thing that most people imagine came from somewhere else. A few myths need to be shaken until the dust falls off. The Phoenicians do not single-handedly invent the alphabet. The Proto-Sinaitic script and the alphabetic Ugaritic cuneiform both precede the standardized Phoenician version. The Phoenicians do not invent coinage. Lydia does that around 650 Bas. The Phoenicians do not run a deliberately secretive tin from Britain monopoly, with assassins on the payroll. Iberia supplies the Western Mediterranean with metals on a scale that dwarfs any sneaky trick. The Phoenicians do not discover the Americas and leave 10 runic letters carved on a boulder in New England. Diffusionist fantasies collapse under the weight of proof. What they do accomplish is large enough without the extras. They refine and export an alphabet and the habits of writing that ride with it. They build a trade network that loops a sea into a system, and they teach their neighbors that easy writing pays. The social math on literacy deserves a realistic appraisal. An alphabet makes writing easier, but it does not turn sailors into novelists overnight. Literacy rates in the ancient world stay low by modern standards because education is expensive, time-consuming, and not valued by everyone. But the threshold drops significantly. Where once 10 years of school wrapped around a profession, now the basics can be picked up by an apprentice in a winter. In port towns, in administrative offices, in warehouses, more hands can write a passable note, label, or receipt. The scribal elite does not vanish. It just has more company. Phoenician letter shapes march, face first into Greek, with almost comedic transparency. Sangmek becomes sigma. Zain becomes zeta. Yod becomes iota. Kaf turns into kappa. Lamed straightens into lambda. Mem, nun. Rish and others get stylized and rotated and settle into the modern forms like furniture that fits a new apartment. Kof gives the Greeks copper, the letter they keep for numbers and discard for words. Wa yields digama and later upsilon. Later, Greek adds phi, chi, psi to deal with its own needs, because the Greek habit of simplifying never stands in the way of the Greek habit of complicating. Direction flips from right to left to right, possibly because most people are right-handed and prefer not to drag their wrists through wet ink. Baustrafton, writing in alternating directions, line by line, shows up as transitional weirdness, like a pilot trying half a dozen landings before picking one runway. On the eastern shorelines of the alphabet's family tree, Aramaic executes a quieter coup. The Achaemenid Persian Empire runs its administration in Aramaic for centuries. The script spreads from Egypt to Central Asia with empire paperwork, which is the flattest form of magic in human history. Jews under Persian rule write legal papyri in Aramaic on Elephantine Island in the Nile in the 5th century Bes, with everyday contracts that include dates, names, quantities, and lines about goats. That is the same alphabetic tradition, even if the letters have shifted shape. Later, Samaritan script preserves an offshoot of Paleo-Hebrew into modern times, while Standard Hebrew prints in the square Aramaic-derived script that has nothing to do with temple architecture and everything to do with Persian bureaucracy. Greek authors never stop name-dropping the Phoenicians because the Greeks cannot stop telling stories about origins. Herodotus calls the letters Phoenician. Thucydides writes about a Phoenician gulf in the Aegean. Homer drops Phoenix as a shorthand for cunning mariners in the 8th century B tradition. The Greeks attribute the letters to Cadmus, mythic founder of Thebes, because Greek myth loves a clever foreigner who both civilizes and makes trouble. Modern historians flip the myth over and see the silt of trade under it. Almina on the Orontes, a trading post at the mouth of a Syrian river, shows Euboeans and Phoenicians mixing goods and style in the 9th and 8th centuries best. Patekousse on Ischia shows Greek and Eastern goods sharing cemetery space. Naucratis in the Nile Delta is a 7th century Bar showcase of Greek-Egyptian exchange. Letters walk with cargo. Meanwhile, in Carthage, the script gets a late-life flourish in the form of the Neo-Punic script. Letters collapse into ligatures and scribal shorthand in the 2nd and 1st centuries Bice, creating a handwriting that looks like a logic puzzle until one learns to read it. Latin authors mock the Punic language and script in their plays and political invective, but those same plays tease the presence of a literate, mercantile culture. Mago of Carthage writes an agricultural treatise in Punic so famous that after Carthage falls in 146 bar, the Roman Senate orders it translated into Latin. The original is lost, but fragments survive in writers like Columella and Varro. If farmers are reading Punic books about grafting vines and planting olives, then somebody is copying those books in an alphabet that inked its way west with cargo ships. The empire that destroys Carthage writes its laws in a script that owes a debt to an earlier sea people. That is a twist good enough for a stage play. Rome imposes Latin legal prose everywhere it can reach. Officials scratch numbers into wax tablets at a rate accountants would envy. Surveyors whip out measurements in straight Latin lines. Soldiers carry discharge certificates when retired. The bones of that writing run through Etruscan and Greek back to Phoenician. A Latin V is a stylized descendant of a Phoenician war. A Latin R traces its head shape back to Phoenician, reached through Greek rho. Rs and Vs on official stones. Gothic echo with Bronze Age cattle and doors. The continuity is not theoretical. It is on every keyboard. Back on that Levantine dock, the cargo tells the rest of the tale. Assyrian annals mention Tyre and Sidon paying tribute. Babylonian records tally shipments of cedar and luxury goods. Persian kings field fleets with Phoenician captains during the Greco-Persian Wars. The alphabet explains part of how this happens smoothly across regimes. A city that can post written regulations, inscribe tariffs, and communicate orders quickly can pivot under new rulers without losing its market. Nobody writes an ode to consistency of surcharge lists, unless they are Ezekiel. But the reality keeps bread on tables and ships under orders. Even the internal structure of the alphabet shows its mercantile birth. The fixed order of letters, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dale, anchors, abecedaries carved on stone, scratched in classrooms, scribbled on shards, show teachers chanting the order and students imitating. The Tel Zayed abecedary from 10th century Beast Judah, though not Phoenician per se, reveals a practice, alphabet order taught outside any one city. Order matters because order makes lookup possible. That little habit, unglamorous and omnivorous, undergirds dictionaries and alphabets on paper. The design is modular. An alphabet chosen well in the 10th century, but still fits a telegraph. The marketing department of the gods gets in on it. Astarte in Baal Hamon, Eshmon, and Melkart's star, in dedicatory inscriptions that pair deity with donor and gift. This produces a small library of texts where civic elites advertise generosity and piety in the same breath, a marketing campaign written in stone for passers-by to admire. The Phoenicians also passed their gods into other language zones easily. Heracles in Greek gets equated with Melkart. Tanit gets compared with goddesses far and wide. The bilingual Kippi in Malta show Melkart's title lined up neatly with Greek equivalents, like a press release translated twice. The exact phonetics of the letters shift from city to city, century to century, like accents on a broadcast, but the core remains stable. When scholars classify inscriptions as Phoenician in the east and Punic in the west, they are measuring time as well as distance. Punic speech habits muddy vowels even more. Inside an abjad, scribes add and subtract little vowels indicators. Cursive forms take over. Punic graffiti on walls in Carthage and in Western colonies likely existed by the thousands. Archaeology picks up scraps, and the scraps are enough to see the habit. Trade demanded paperwork, and the alphabet met the demand. The mundane nature of letters also protected their spread. A system that works for shipping receipts gets adopted by neighbors because everyone has something to ship. Education follows commerce. Farmers write crop tallies. Religious functionaries list sacrifices. Officials schedule corvée labor. Individuals carve names into tombs, so their memory does not evaporate instantly. Ship owners scratch names onto planks. The Mazaron hull even preserves markings that look like assembly instructions. Engineers everywhere recognize that vibe. The moment when a complex operation generates sticky notes. On the subject of purple, one more bit of data completes the picture. Pliny's info about the dye's price connects with the Edict of Maximum Prices by Diocletian in 301 C, which sets mind-numbing prices for purple-dyed textiles centuries after Tyre's golden age. That late Roman price-fixing drama confirms a long-term pattern. Purple is always obscene money. That is the brand. Tyrian purple never needed an influencer. It dyed emperors and bishops like it was born to dominate a camera. The Phoenicians do get one story credit that later users forget. They had no empire in the formal, marching army, provinces, and proconsul sense. Their commonwealth rides the wind and currents. City-states dominate their harbors, and connections matter more than conquests. The alphabet fits that shape perfectly. It is portable, standardized enough to cross harbors, flexible enough to slip into any temple dedication or customs ledger. It does not belong to a palace. It belongs to whoever can afford a pen. A few precise dates anchor all this. The Byblos inscriptions. Herum, Yamil cluster in the 10th century Bas. The Nora stone in Sardinia likely lands in the 9th century Bas. Carthage's founding lands between the late 9th and early 8th century Bas. The traditional 814 Bas date from Timaeus gives a mnemonic that archaeology refines. The Greek Diplon inscription hovers around 740 Bach. Nestor's cup around 730 Bach. The Karatate bilingual is 8th century Bas. Hanno's Periplus claims a 5th century Bai date. Himilco's reported voyages slot near the same. The Eshmenaza inscription prints in the 5th century Bas. The Kippi of Melkart in Malta arrive in the 2nd century Bas. One can plot the alphabet's westward sprint on that sequence and see the trade lanes behind the dates like contrails. Source voices amplify this timeline. Herodotus 5.5861 on Cadmus and the letters. Herodotus 4.42 on the African circumnavigation under Necho II. And that sun on the right detail. Diodorus Siculus 5.2223 on tin roots and Atlantic fog. Pliny the Elder, Natural History 9.60 and other sections, on purple dye. Ezekiel 27 on Tyre's trade partners. The Karatate bilingual for aligning Luwian and Phoenician. The Peergy tablets for Etruscan and Phoenician. The Kippi of Melkart for bilingual alignment. These are not all reliable in the same degree, but together they map a sea of connections. That is the point. It's worth peeking inside a single sign again to appreciate the engineering. Aleph began as a stylized ox head, rotated 90 degrees. Beta, Beth, began as the outline of a house. The shapes in early Phoenician script are simple geometric gestures, optimized for quick carving or writing. The Greeks take those geometries and file the edges, render them in brush and chisel, rotate again, and spawn the letter forms that later scribes formalize into Trajan-style Roman capitals and book hands. The only reason a modern eye recognizes the capital A as an abstract triangle with a crossbar is because someone in the Levant, more than 3,000 years ago, simplified an ox. One last trade route shows up where least expected. Colonial histories love to link the Libyco-Berber script, ancestor of modern Tifina, used by Amazigh communities, to Phoenician and Punic. The earliest Libyco-Berber inscriptions appear in the late 1st millennium Bas. Many scholars see a tie to Punic influence in North Africa because the timing and geography align, though the exact mechanism is debated. The idea that mobile traders brush against mobile herders and farmers and leave behind a writing habit fits the pattern everywhere else. It would be stranger if nothing had rubbed off. This whole story leaves one last proof lying in plain sight. When Romans and later Europeans talk about letters, their technical terms preserve the Levantine origin. Alphabet, abecedary, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dale. The root syllables are visible like fossils in sediment. The letters become invisible by becoming infrastructure. Everybody uses them. Nobody notices them. That is the quiet fate of tools that win. The trade they powered has its own afterlife. Greek literature ossifies into a canon because someone writes it down. Homer's epics land on papyrus and then parchment. Laws codify because proscription lists make better political theatre when read aloud from stone in the forum. The Carthaginian treaties with Rome, recorded in Greek by Polybius, exist because a literate culture writes details into agreements and then archives them. Treaties, contracts, vows, temple gifts, graffiti, curses, all the forms of writing that make a society legible to itself, become easier to produce when the writing system lets an ordinary mind learn it. The Phoenicians, almost insultingly, do not leave behind a grand epic in their own letters that modern classrooms teach. Sanchuniathon, a supposed Phoenician author preserved in later Greek fragments, is as much enigma as source. What remains instead are cost-effective habits. Give that relationship its due. A queue of 30 amphorae labelled with a trader's name and capacity and destination becomes more important for cultural history than a single marble-smooth poem, only less romantic. A warehouse's shipping ledger makes the sea a system in a way myth could not. It also leaves less to frame. A few concrete scenes nail this down. At Sardinia's Nora, around the 9th century BC, a stone marks a presence from the east in letters simple enough to be carved by someone who knew craft, not just priesthood. In Malta, 2 squat limestone kippi let a 2nd century Bas reader flip between Greek and Phoenician, like they are reading a dual-column language textbook. In Turkey's Cilicia highlands, a bilingual at Karatepe lays out a king's deeds in 2 scripts so that his neighbours hear him in their words and his in his. In Sidon, Eshmunazar's sarcophagus threatens tomb violators with cosmic lawsuit in lines that modern epigraphers pass word by word. In Spain, a little ship off Mazarone preserves pegged tenons and marks that look like assembly guides. Every carpenter's pencil survives in principle, even when the ink fades. Some of the best proof is negative. Understanding across the Mediterranean improves so quickly in the 8th-6th centuries beast that art, coinage, law and religion show a rush of borrowing. Greek artisans everywhere put Phoenician lotus and palmette motifs into friezes, like it's the hot embroidery of the season. Phoenician craftspeople adopt Greek styles and then sell them back. This is not a one-way street. It is a two-way ferry, and the lettered labels on the crates help keep returns moving. An alphabet is not the cause of all of this, but it is lubricant. No single person gets to take credit, which is the real reason the story does not blow up in the way some conquests do. There is no Phoenician Alexander the Great. There is no Phoenician Caesar. There is 1,000 pilots, sailmakers, shipwrights, scribes and traders, and their names flash up in inscriptions like stars in a night sky. Present, modest and persistent. Tabnit, Eshmunaza, Bodishtad, Yayem Milk, Azati Wada. The gods stay the same, even as the rulers change. The letters stay the same, even as the hands that write them change. The sea amplifies good ideas and punishes bad ones. The Phoenician alphabet catches the wind and ends up everywhere the wind blows. It is boring in the best way. It says specifically what went where and sometimes why. It says who owes whom and how much. It says which god got which gift, at which temple, in which year, and what the threatened penalty is if someone cheats. It says that a craftsperson named so-and-so donated a votive so that he might live, or she might be remembered. It is not poetry first. It's a receipt system that gets promoted to everything. The payoff comes in the sheer magnitude of what grows from that seed. Greek literature looks inevitable only in hindsight. It survives through copying in alphabets that map sounds to signs compactly enough that a monk in a scriptorium can train and retrain on the fly and keep the pipeline going. Roman law looks inevitable only in hindsight. It is preserved and referenced and argued through centuries because the medium keeps paying dividends. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sacred texts wind their way through Phoenician-derived alphabets. Whether Hebrew square, Greek uncial, or Arabic nusk, and carry their ideas across continents. A writing system's influence is measured in how many other people forget it is a system. The Phoenician alphabet reaches maximum invisibility by absolute success. And behind all of that, the docks keep stinking in their sharp, sweet way. The murex piles do not care about metaphors. Carpenters still fit tenons and pegs. Sailors still fold and unfold canvas. A ledger still gets scribbled on a pot shard while a supervisor yells. The ink still smears if someone leans too hard. That is the milieu where 22 letters quietly changed global history. No crowns required. No marble statue of an inventor in a square. Just an idea streamlined and spread like a sturdy sail that anyone could afford. And everyone learned to use. Years later, when a modern hand types a password, the ghost of a goad prods the X, and a door sits in the D, and a head looks out from the R, and a tooth chews on the S. Every ordinary keyboard stems from an ancient convenience. The Phoenician alphabet nested into trade and then detonated into culture, law, memory, and belief. It rode piggyback on cedar and purple, and it delivered the world a tool that barbarians, kings, and accountants all found useful. That is the influence, and it is everywhere, classily underdressed and commercially unstoppable. Here is the clean ending that the record deserves. A stripped-down consonant set becomes the foundation not just for Greek tragedies, Roman proclamations, Hebrew psalms, and Arabic poetry, but for the blinking river of characters rolling right now across 1 billion screens. It begins with scribes who look like nobodies and cities that never rule a continent. It spreads as a habit more than a law. It thrives because it saves time and money. It survives because neighbors find it cheap to copy. The Phoenician alphabet did not just inscribe history, it industrialized handwriting for a sea full of traders and, almost incidentally, gave half the planet a way to write. That is not a myth. That is a receipt.